We've all heard that the brisket is king of the barbecue, and if that's the case, this brisket here is the king of kings. This is an A5 Wagyu brisket, the most expensive brisket money can buy over here in Australia. And today we're going to cook her up and see if she's actually worth all the hype and the extra dosh. Now, before we prepare this one, let's get into a little bit of an anatomy lesson. The brisket comes from the chest of the cow, essentially the pectoral muscles. The brisket contains two muscles. That's four. The point end, which is usually used to make things like burnt ends because it's so much fattier, and the leaner flat, which is usually a little bit tougher and drier, but I don't think we're going to have an issue today because we're using Wagyu. It's a little bit like a cheat code because of the extra fat content. When it comes to trimming a brisket, there's a couple of things that we're trying to achieve. The first is to try and cut off some of the exterior fat. Yes, fat is flavor, but big chunks like this are going to have a tough time rendering down, which is going to prevent our bark from forming on the outside. So it's got to go. As a rule of thumb, you do want to leave a little bit of fat on the leaner side of the brisket just so that you give it the best chance of possible at being juicy and tender. But again, we're using Wagyu today, so I don't think we're going to have to worry about that.
I mean, just look at the marbling here, both on the point and the flat end. This is unlike any other brisket I've ever seen before.
The second thing we're trying to do is make the brisket as aerodynamic as possible. We want that smoke to glide over the meat in the kettle, so we want to try and make it as smooth as possible and cut off any rough edges to do that. My God, this thing is so fatty that fat is literally rendering on my hands when I'm touching it. That's insane. Now I know it looks like we've completely butchered our brisket and wasted a whole ton of that fat Wagyu. When it comes to brisket, there is zero waste. I like to vacuum seal this stuff up so I can turn it into beef tallow at a later date. You can even mince it up and use it for burgers. You can feed it to your dog. Just don't throw it out. As for seasoning a brisket, I like to keep it nice and simple. Salt, pepper, garlic. Beef already has such a strong umami flavor, you really just want to enhance the natural flavor of the beef, not add much to it. I mean, you totally can, but that's just my preference. And with such a large piece of meat, you're definitely going to want to dry brine it in the fridge overnight to let that salt penetrate deep into the tissue. I'll see you in the morning. And due to the magic of editing, it's the morning time, we're ready to cook. Why am I whispering? My wife is still asleep. We're gonna pop the thermometer in and pop her on the kettle, low and slow at 250, smoking over applewood.
At about the 3 to 4 hour mark, I like to come out every 30 minutes or so and just give it a little spritz of apple cider vinegar. This isn't 100% necessary and I don't see everyone do this, but I personally like to do it just to keep the exterior from drying out.
One eternity later.
And 7 hours later, she's probing around 160, and this is a very crucial time in the cook. This is where a brisket's temperature is usually going to stall for a couple of hours. This happens because a lot of moisture from the meat is getting evaporated and counteracting the heat coming from the kettle. It's also the temperature where the collagen and connective tissue start to break down, so that takes a lot of energy too. So to help the brisket get through its stall, we're gonna wrap her up. Now, classically, you would use butcher's paper to wrap up a brisket, but honestly, I'm not a big fan of this method. I prefer using the foil boat method because this is gonna catch any juices that come out of the bottom of the brisket, and it's gonna keep the top bark exposed and firm. At this point, we also don't need the kettle any longer since we've already infused our meat with the smoky flavor. You can just transfer it to the oven to finish cooking.
2,000 years later.
And we're here with our finished brisket. You're probably wondering why there's two packages in front of me. Well, usually when I'm cooking a brisket, I'm just gonna wait till it's probe tender, it's hit temperature, wrap it up, let it rest like normal. But this time, something happened that hasn't ever happened before. The point end still had another 20 or 30 degrees to go, while the flat was ready to come out. And I had two options. I either could continue to cook the meat, let the flat dry out, and get the point to the perfect temperature, or I could take it out early, the point's gonna be underdone, and the flat was gonna be perfect. So I did the unthinkable, cut the brisket in half, wrapped up the flat and let that rest, and put the point back in to get to temp. I've honestly never done anything like that before, and I thought that this was the best way to save the brisket. Both sides were taken out at 203 degrees Fahrenheit, and both were probe tender.
The point's been resting for about 4 hours, the flat 5.
Time to cut up and dig in.
After 12 hours of cooking and 5 hours of resting, the time had finally come to slice in and see once and for all if a Wagyu brisket is worth selling my kidney for. I started with the flat end and it was delicious. Pull apart tender and definitely juicier than a regular brisket. You could definitely taste the difference. Mochi also thought so.
Oh, there he is.
And the point end took things to a whole nother level. I literally did not have to chew it, that's how tender it was. And the flavor was out of this world, like butter. Despite how incredible it was, I do think I could have gotten it even more tender and juicy if I had let it rest completely overnight and sliced it at a slightly higher temperature. But hey, perhaps something to try in the future with another Wagyu brisket. But we still haven't answered the question at hand. Is it worth paying 3 times as much for a Wagyu brisket?
Would I get this above a regular brisket? Yes. Maybe if I'm doing like a big event for friends or family, I really want to show off a little bit. If I'm just doing it for a home cook, probably not. Hey guys, hope you enjoyed the video. Hit that like button, hit the sub button, and I'll see you next time.
Great success! #1 brisket in all Kazakhstan!